Welcome to The Digital Patient, where we discuss the latest advancements in digital patient engagement and share stories from the front lines. I'm your host, Alan Sardana, and with me as always is Seamless MD's CEO, Dr. Joshua Liu. Today we're joined by two awesome guests, Dr. Rachel McEntee, CMIO at the University of Vermont, and Dr. Justin Stinnett-Donnelly, Associate VP and Business Owner for Inpatient and Ancillary Applications. Rachel and Justin, welcome both to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is absolutely such an honor to have you both on today. You've really been through the trenches in digital health, and you've dealt with the most insane pressures, consolidating to a system-wide Epic implementation during COVID while being under a cyber security attack that forced you back to paper charting. I'm sorry for bringing this up again. I'm sure it's a traumatic incident that you've gone through, but through all of this adversity, you've really come out ahead and are now leading digital transformation at UVM. It's so exciting to see. It's interesting to note that you both came from the internal medicine world, and I'm really curious how you both ended up in informatics because of that. But maybe to start the conversation, what was the moment or motivations for you to get into internal medicine and informatics in the first place?
I can go first on that. So I would say it was definitely not pre-planned. For a long time, going through both medical school and residency, I had a plan to actually become an electrophysiologist. And really, along that journey, I started to have some different interests. And it kind of started in residency with actually in medical school as well, really looking at population health, quality of care, like how can we actually really impact that at scale? Like I think many of what our colleagues do is incredibly impactful, one patient at a time. The whole concept of population health and how we deliver these types of tools can impact hundreds of thousands, a million patients potentially. And being able to give those tools to people has been amazing. The change for me too happened when I decided I wanted to make sure that I was in control of where I worked and where I lived. And I also had some concerns about super specializing and not having that same level of control. And so that determined my path to kind of stop at internal medicine, even after applying for cardiology fellowship, and really look at my first attending job here in Vermont. When I got to Central Vermont Medical Center, I had been at our academic medical center, been using Epic and, all of the tools that were associated with that in the 2013 timeframe. And when I got to CDMC, what I encountered was for the first time, I had to write down a paper order sets. I had to transcribe into a telephone. And I remember my neck being incredibly sore for that first year. And so for me, it came down to my hospitalist medical director at that time said, hey, I heard you had worked with Epic and electronic records. The IT department here needs some help with this thing, CPOE, and we have to put it into place. And they really would like some help. And so that was my first kind of foray into delivering a CPOE system and that with that vendor as part of meeting our meaningful use stage 2 criteria. And so that helped me really begin to know my colleagues in a new way, as well as the IT teams, and bridging that divide between them.
That's fantastic. Rachel, was it similar story for yourself or?
Similar story, not exactly the same. So I always tell people my parents told me around 1990 or so that my job when I grew up would be computer stuff. So besides that, it was not my plan at all. I really started getting involved in the Epic improvement and optimization work when I was a chief resident in internal medicine, when all of a sudden sort of this time and space opens up where for me, I could start thinking about the systems of how we deliver care. So similar to Justin in that regard. Someone said, we need a chief to go to all these Epic meetings. We're sort of like who drew the short straw. And then when I got there, I realized that it was so much more about people and process than the technology itself. And that it was such an amazing sort of way to insert myself into the systems thinking and, not just impacting one patient at a time, but my interest sort of really started with the people and into sort of like clinician well-being and, how many patients could you impact by helping each clinician on kind of the math there. So for other people, it was like the last thing they wanted to go to a meeting about. And I started to get excited. And then just, I've always loved to learn. So there was such a huge like self-education component to it. But that's really what you're doing.
One of the things that I've found is that like when there are certain activities that would be horrible for other people to do, but for you, it's like, it's a chore I'm willing to do. I think you kind of found maybe the right spot in your job.
Today's episode is brought to you by DeepScribe, AI clinical documentation that physicians and health systems love, documenting specialty and complex care with ease and precision. Josh, have you heard all the buzz around ambient AI and virtual scribes?
Definitely. Clinicians are spending hours a day on documentation, so improving their day-to-day and reducing burnout is huge right now. You and I have seen quite a few product demos for ambient this year, but I have to say, DeepScribe was one of the most impressive.
Well, Josh, you trained as a clinician. What stood out to you most about DeepScribe?
Well, using AI to transcribe and summarize the clinician-patient conversation is honestly table stakes right now. But a big challenge for CMIOs and CIOs is driving actual clinician adoption. So what really impressed me about DeepScribe is how well it can be customized to different specialties and workflows with dozens of templates as starting points. That would be critical to me as a clinician because I just don't have time to build templates from scratch.
So true. For me, I was particularly impressed by the auditable notes. You can highlight any part of a note, and then DeepScribe shows you exactly where in the transcript the note was generated from. So you can find that evidence right away. That builds trust.
Oh, exactly. Being able to confirm that something wasn't hallucinated is so important for clinician trust and safety.
Yeah, that same attention to detail that led to really high clinician adoption is also resulting with clinicians saving up to 75% of documentation time.
Wow, that's incredible. But how is DeepScribe's accuracy with specialty care or complex cases?
That's the best part. DeepScribe's proprietary LLM, Keel AI, is trained on over 3 million patient conversations. It's then further tuned by specialty and subspecialty cases, making it way more accurate than GPT-4-based solutions. Pair that accuracy with DeepScribe's customization studio to personalize the experience for different clinician preferences and workflows, and it becomes incredibly flexible.
Alan, speaking of flexibility, I could use some yoga myself. Flexibility is key when it comes to working with health systems with so many moving parts. DeepScribe sounds fantastic. Where can health systems learn more?
About your yoga? I don't think they want to. But about DeepScribe, check out deepscribe.ai. That's deepscribe.ai to learn more.
One of the things I was curious about was you all trained and worked in a time where you had experienced paper charting, and then you've done the EHR and the tech documentation. But for any new trainee or most trainees who are coming up in healthcare now, they may only have ever done, EHR charting, never done paper. I'm curious, do you think that we've lost something in terms of certain skill sets or thought processes if you don't end up ever doing paper charting?
So it's really fascinating. I was asked to go in front of the med students this year and talk about personalization and sort of efficient workflows for the EHR. And last year they gave me an hour. This is sort of the bridge week before the start fellowship. Last year they gave me an hour, and by popular demand, they expanded it to almost 6 hours. And I had to figure out how to fill that. So I was up there giving my typical speech about why it's important in initial experience, and they just were staring at me like I was saying the most obvious thing in the world. It was the speech I give our attendings and legacy users. And they were just like, yeah, of course we need to learn how to use the system well and be efficient at it. And, it's just one of the tools. You could just tell there's just one of the tools they use. And it would be sort of hard to imagine life without it. And so the question of, are we losing skills in our trainees? I think it's kind of a little bit of a false narrative. I think we just have to change what we learn to be appropriate to the technology that we have today. There's that famous cartoon of teachers protesting calculators. From the 1940s, right? So it's not that extreme, but they're like, you'll never have a calculator in your pocket. And actually we do. We all have calculators in our pocket. So it's hard to predict what will come. And so I think we just have to sort of be flexible enough to adapt the skills and then really understand the concept. So if something does happen, the systems go down, you can still know how to take care of patients, which is really what matters. I don't know, Justin, what your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. I think getting expanded to 6 hours is a testament to your lecturing skills and the stories you tell. But
of course, it wasn't a lecture. We made it interactive.
So, yeah, I think it's not that there's something lost. I agree that's a little bit of a false narrative. I think there's a lot to be gained, and it's kind of more about resilience, right? So we do need to, as an industry, this is outside of UVM Health Network, have really good strategies in place for if those tools are suddenly unavailable for any kind of reason, right? And that really speaks to the resilience of our workforce and the diversity of the experiences that they've had at some point throughout the course of their career. We spend a tremendous amount of effort building, maintaining, implementing these systems because they're so valuable, because it's really difficult to deliver efficient, high quality care in the systems that we have without them. Otherwise, we wouldn't spend all that time and effort. So I don't think it's a question of one or the other, but it's really a question of how do we make sure as a system, as providers, that we're in a position to continue that, even if there is a disruption in our ability to deliver the electronic systems. We never want that to happen, but we've seen over and over that it can and it will in the world that we live in today.
We've only seen documentation accelerate. So that's my cheesy segue into ambient, because, Al and I have read about how, at Vermont, you've been a recent leader and pioneer in using, Scribes for documentation. I think one of the unique things that you did was, it sounds like you did like a crossover comparison of two solutions before you end up actually growing with one of them. Maybe talk a bit about the origins of like why you started to investigate ambient, and how do you actually construct sort of a comparison of this technology right now?
Go ahead, Rachel.
I plan to say a general statement, and then I'm going to turn over to Justin, because he has just been such an amazing leader in this space. So the key thing before we went into this at all is that we really tried to think about what we were going to measure, and making sure what we measured mattered and it was meaningful to what we were trying to achieve. That's sort of like the big picture kind of philosophical view we try to take in our informatics program. And then, this was Justin's, like, I think we can do this better. I'm going to do it. And I'm going to get all the people who I need to come along with me. And it was just amazing to watch. So I'll let him tell sort of the specific story. But I think that sort of philosophically is where we started from.
Thank you for that. So I think when we started out, we looked at the landscape like you do with any type of technology, right? Who are the different vendors? How do they integrate with our existing systems? All of those types of questions. But we pretty quickly reached the conclusion that this is pretty new. This is not something that's going to be easy to really assess without using multiple solutions I'll call it in the wild. We need to make sure that it's not just our informaticists or people who are highly comfortable with change and new technology. We really need to assess it broader than that, because the applicability is potentially a large swath of our provider population. And so we really wanted to ask them which solution meets your needs today. Now, all of these vendors are rapidly developing their solution, and so things will change over time. But at least from what we experienced in a snapshot of time, we had 50 primary care providers. We selected primary care because they're ambulatory based and they have extremely high rates of burnout. Our primary endpoint was essentially burnout reduction. It was purely a quality of practice initiative for our healthcare network. We took some secondary measures in the how people felt about maybe adding on an additional patient visit, but that was by no means the primary endpoint that we were looking at. And then what we saw was that once we went through an 8-week process of kind of getting two groups of 25 to use each product, and then we crossed them over, we were able to see pretty quickly what the preference was. And then we were able to, as an organization, make a decision about, what we would be going forward with. And so it was really informed by those 50 primary care providers, which were hugely diverse. We had, not sure what the longest duration of practice was for our pilot users, but a good chunk of them, I want to say about 20%, had been practicing for more than 20 years. So these are not necessarily just, people who are early adopters of technology. And it was almost a little bit bimodal. We certainly had people who are excited to try new things and kind of, early adopters, but we also had a group that I would categorize as the extremely burnt, who are looking for anything to help them. And they raised their hands as well. And we saw that in our survey data when we surveyed them about their burnout rates prior to utilizing ambient products. And then what we almost uniformly saw was, this is not a solution that's going to work for 100% of providers, but for a sizable percentage, we saw those burnout rates reduce dramatically and rapidly. And that was really rewarding to see.
I'm curious because, I think when I first started reading about ambient and talking to digital leaders like yourselves, I had what turned out, I think, to be a false assumption that the early adopters would always be the very tech savvy folks. When in fact, I think I heard about a lot of clinicians who were very tech and document savvy who said, hey, actually, I'm really good with documentation. I don't need actually a solution, even though AI is cool and all that. So I'm curious, were you surprised by the types of folks who did versus didn't adopt?
No, I didn't. So I think that's right. But I also think what we've seen is we have a tremendous number of of pilot participants that I would categorize as being very efficient with their documentation. I mean, they know they have it all set up. Some of them are our physician informaticists, they're builders, but they also found benefit, a lot of them. And the reason for that is that if you're able to change your practice so that you're able to just kind of sit here and focus on what you're doing, there's an amazing thing that happens with cognitive load. So instead of me thinking about, okay, I need to now jot this down, and I'm constantly task shifting, right? I'm task shifting between talking with you, doing my documentation, thinking about, what the follow-up plan is going to be and doing my orders. If you can reduce that task shifting a little bit, so you're just more focused on, okay, what's the next question I have to ask that patient? How do I respond to what they just said? All of those things add up. And then you can see that the cognitive load of conducting and then documenting that visit drops, and that creates space to do other things. So I think we see the deltas in people that were really struggling with their documentation. I think people who can adopt it and really just kind of like let go and be in that space without task shifting, less task shifting at least, really enjoy it. And it's kind of remarkable. I mean, I've used a handful of times in my hospitalist practice. I know Rachel has as well. And it's just a very different experience. So just sit there, talk, know that it's kind of being captured, and I don't have to even, I was never someone who kind of typed the note as I was talking to the patient, but I was always taking notes because I can't remember. Is basically what it comes down to after my 5th admission. I need my notes in order to make sure that I don't, switch around people. And so being able to just focus on that one encounter and drive that conversation has a tremendous impact.
I'll just add one more component of it, because I think the focus is really key and could be applied in really any not industry, but any sort of field. I think specific to what we heard from our pilot users was that it felt like their day felt more meaningful to them, right? So, one of the key drivers of burnout is like, how much % of your time do you spend doing something meaningful? And you don't have to make that much of a change in that percentage to really drive down burnout. So I don't think any of us went into medicine because we find it meaningful to type notes on the computer. Like, that would be very rare. There's a few people who will just take such pride in their notes. It's like they want to get an A+, and that's fine. But the vast majority of us want to provide clinical care over patients and be able to focus on them. And so I think that's really was driving some of the, a fair amount of the changes that we saw in people's experience. And I think that's what makes it different from other technologies too, is that it is really, in my experience and what we heard from our users, is that it really sort of fundamentally changed the experience as just that of that patient interaction. And also the experience of technology, because if it works well, it's invisible. It's sort of like how I like to think of it. And then it's just sort of aiding you in the parts of your job that are less meaningful for you. And then you could potentially have downstream benefit as well. So that's really how we approached it. And one of the other things I was going to add also is, you could see a situation where you have someone who's really burned out and sort of desperate for help, and you present a new tool, and they might see that as an additional burden to try out a new tool. But I think the way we framed it organizationally as what we were measuring was whether this helps you, made those people more likely to sort of stand up and raise their hand and volunteer. So, it sort of helped pull in some of those outliers, I think.
All of that. Can I ask you, like, how do you all think about where this technology should go? So, for example, maybe right now it's really focused on automating the documentation piece, but certainly at some point you could imagine maybe it starts recommending differentials or potential plans, but then maybe you don't want to lose that kind of autonomy of how you're designing the plan for the patient. So I'm kind of curious, like, where do you want it to go next? What actually makes sense from a clinician point of view?
I think the primary focus needs to continue to be on kind of reducing the documentation burden, to be quite honest. I think things like queuing up orders, I think coding, all of those are really interesting use cases. What you're talking about, Josh, as far as differential diagnosis generation, really queuing up kind of like a detailed assessment and plan, particularly with complex patients, I think we need to study that. I don't know what the impact of that is going to be. I think it is really interesting, but I also don't want to presume that it's going to ultimately result in improved patient outcomes. And so that's the key here. We're having conversations internally, with our family medicine residency directors and other educators around how do we set up a research arm to essentially start asking those questions. And that's not just at UVM Health Network. That is needed across our entire country, right? Or the world as we learn, how do these technologies impact our learners? How do they impact our attendees who they have kind of a deep set of knowledge that they're able to pull on? So I think it's a good question, but I'm really focused on things that are making our providers more efficient, reducing documentation burden, at least with the products that I see on the market today.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting to see technology that can try to undo some of the problems that technology created.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that should really be the first focus. I was just going back to Alan's question about, I think you asked why internal medicine. And for me, it was sitting in conference doing a differential diagnosis, right? Like the clinical reasoning is why I love internal medicine. And I just knew that first hour of noon report, I had found my space within medicine. And so I think that's a far ways off from being replaced. I think there's so many things about human intuition and human decision-making that are going to be could potentially be augmented, but I don't think we're there.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, the documentation is like the low-hanging fruit. It's like the safer path to assess and implement right now. You've had the successful pilot. You're scaling this out now. It sounds like more broadly at the health system. So many different specialties or groups that you could go to next. Strategically, how do you think about where you should go next with it internally?
So we're partnering with a governance structure within our medical group. So we have a digital and remote practice committee. And so we're bringing that strategy to that group. And so it's endorsed by a group of physicians who have been elected by their peers to be on that group. So I think that part is actually really important to highlight, is that it's not me, it's not Rachel, it's that group that's ultimately endorsing the overall strategy. So the strategy that we're using is we're going to continue to scale in primary care, and we're in the process of doing that right now. How you implement, you need to make sure that your providers are supported through the change. It seems simple to say, but it's really, really, really important. You can't just share a video and then provision them access, because you're not going to get the same adoption rate. It's still new. It still requires a change in your practice style. It requires taking the moment to verbally consent the patient at the beginning, bringing out a device, hitting the record button. None of those individual steps are hard, but it is the change. And you have to kind of give yourself some permission that this is going to feel awkward at first. It's going to be different. I need to really do 10 to 20 of these before I'm going to begin to really feel comfortable with it and learn where it works, where it doesn't, and where it's helpful. And there's no requirement that you use it, X percentage of the time at this point. So we're really focused on making sure that we have a person in the clinic that we're bringing live about once per week, and that we're doing a really good training plan for them. Now, once we move outside of primary, so we feel like we understand primary care really well at this point, but I'm not going to say that we understand specialty care or the tremendous diversity that is present within our specialty care clinics, right? And so we're going to be using our Epic Smart users as kind of early adopters for this in specialty care, offer them the opportunity to use it, and provide us feedback. I'm hopeful that that strategy will do a couple things. It'll give us a little bit of an early indication of where we think this is going to be the most impactful. And it'll also provide some kind of collegial seeding of expertise within those departments that then their colleagues will have a trusted person that they're able to go to as we scale it within a given department. We haven't started that yet. We're going to hopefully kick that off in the next several weeks, kind of like the ambient early access program.
That's really smart.
Yeah, I think the key there is just what you said about trust, right? It's a trusted colleague who understands your workflows. There's so much uniqueness around specialties, right? No one could possibly understand what it's like to practice as X, right? But we have a really amazing group of smart users, sort of our super user group, who are interested in sort of changing that dynamic and really partnering with us. And so I think the key to that group being successful is that we really listen. It's not just for show. Someone comes back and they said, this is going to work for this reason, it's not going to work for this reason. Justin and I go back and advocate for that. So I think that group feels empowered to bring the feedback to us because of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amazing. So I just want to shift the conversation slightly. Besides ambient, I'm curious to know your thoughts on low-hanging fruit, highest ROI for other AI use cases. I know you're using it all across the board, but what are your thoughts so far? What are the standout use cases that you see? And then maybe on the flip side, what do you think is overhyped today?
Yeah,
I'll start.
The highest ROI.
Highest ROI right now, to be quite honest, are things that make our workflow more efficient, that automate steps that are taking a human being to complete them that tend to be very repetitive. So we're really looking at those. Like we're looking at not only and also looking at items in the imaging space, right? Are there workflow enabling technologies that make it so if I'm an echosonographer, as an example, and I capture, I'm not going to be able to replace the echosonographer, right? Like that's you got to be there touching the patient. There's a whole series of different things that are required. But if as part of that study, I have to go and draw lines or circles or make different measurements of the images that I captured, and that's kind of repetitive, that I think is something that AI is quite good at doing and can significantly reduce the amount of time that person needs to take. So it'll do the measurement and draw the lines and draw the circles. And then the amount of time that it takes to validate that, yes, that circle's in the right place, that line is going from, across the aorta like I would expect it to. Yes, no, oh, I got to draw a line myself because that wasn't quite right. You can save significant time and you can improve access. So if you have a constraint in your people, which I think a lot of healthcare organizations do today, and we certainly do, then anything you can do to make your people more efficient and improve access is something we really want to look at and try to adopt as soon as we're able to, thoughtfully and safely. As far as overhyped, it's AI is such a interesting term, right? So you kind of say AI and people are like, replace doctors. And you're like, well, what does a doctor do all day, right? And what I would say the overhyped piece for me is that concept, right? Like, so most of the solutions that I see that we would be interested in implementing are kind of point solutions, right? They're really good at doing one thing. There is not a solution yet, maybe it'll develop in the future, that's really good at aggregating all of that together, okay? And really making that seamless. That's what humans right now are really good at doing. And so I think the really exciting piece is how do you couple the human with that point technology and then continue to evaluate how do these things, start to fit together so that you can drive even more quality and even more efficiency out of the systems that you have.
When people ask me if I think doctors will be replaced, I often think about how even with all the advanced medical technology that was imagined in Star Trek, there was still a ship's doctor. And it was a really important role. And that's because, in my mind, along with art, technology is actually one of the things that make us human and sort of differentiate us in human societies is technology. And so medicine is so old, and it's old for a reason, right? So human interaction with other humans trained to care for them is just always a necessary part of being human. So specifically, what that will look like is always going to change, but I don't think it'll be replaced. I agree. I think that's an overhyped kind of concept.
Today's episode is brought to you by SeamlessMD, which enables health systems to digitize patient care journeys, leading to lower lengths of stay, readmissions, and costs. Josh, you used to be a doctor. Did you ever feel like patients showed up unprepared for surgery? Or maybe you felt like you were sending patients into a black hole after discharge?
All the time. We give patients paper and verbal instructions, which are so easy to forget and really hard to follow. And we have no idea what happens to them outside the hospital. So what happens? Well, because we worry about them, we keep patients in hospital longer, but that drives up length of stay and lowers throughput. Plus, after they leave, patients get readmitted for infections and all kinds of problems that we could have just caught earlier if we monitored patients.
What if I told you there was a way to give every patient a virtual companion so you could automatically engage and monitor them through a surgery, a cancer journey, or a chronic care journey, and drop the length of stay, increase throughput, and lower readmissions?
Gosh, Alan, that would be amazing.
So that is exactly what SeamlessMD does. It allows health systems to engage patients on their own phone, tablet, or computer with automated reminders, education, and symptom monitoring. Basically a GPS through any healthcare journey.
That sounds fantastic.
but does it actually work?
It does. Health systems have done over 40 studies and evaluations showing how they use the solution to reduce length of stay by 1 to 2 days, readmissions by up to 89%, and costs by over $1,000 per patient.
Huh. But how does that work with my EHR?
That's the best part. Seamless MD is the only solution in this space with direct integration partnerships with Epic and MyChart, Oracle Cerner, and Meditech.
Huh. Well, I am getting a colonoscopy soon, so I really need something like this. Where can my health system learn more?
Well, Josh, thanks for letting me know. Your health is very important, and endoscopy is just one out of the 50 plus out-of-the-box care plans available today on Seamless MD. Go to www.seamless.md. That's www.seamless.md to learn more.
Can I ask you, you are in an academic medical center, you have residents, you have fellows. Now, as staff yourself, you've gone through the whole training. So, let's say you were a staff radiologist, you know how to read all the images independently and all that. But you can imagine, as an up-and-coming trainee, if AI was at your disposal, you could probably do a lot of things without having to necessarily have learned it all yourself. So I'm kind of curious, how you think about the application of AI in the context of clinical training. Because, for example, you could have trainees now who never have to write a note on their own. Maybe you want them to for some time before you put in the ambient. I'm kind of curious how you're using, let's say, ambient or other AI in training right now.
So we are not using ambient yet in training. And we're in active conversations with our family medicine department, our GME department around how to responsibly do that. I'm going to go back to, we have to study this. We can't presume that we know the answer. It also, though, means we shouldn't not do it, right? If you go back, I always have this vision in my head. It's kind of like with POCUS, but if you go back even further in time, right? You can see a time in medicine where you had the percussionists on one side, and then somebody came up with the stethoscope, right? And the percussionists are all arguing that you shouldn't use the stethoscope because you're going to lose your percussion, your ability to be an amazing percussionist, right? But clearly the stethoscope provides a lot more fidelity, a lot more information that you can potentially get. So it's not really well, you shouldn't use this because you might lose this other set of skills. It's how are you going to use this technology safely, effectively to further the care of our patients. So that's how I view it. But I do think the point is well taken that we don't know exactly what that long-term outcome is. And when you think about something like medical education, that is measured in years, sometimes in a decade. So the time horizon is very long, and we just have to be very smart in how we thoughtfully deploy it and then how we measure it over time and not presume that it's going to be better. We have to prove that it's going to be better.
Definitely a fair point.
I just want to add that I think it's really challenging and complex, but going back to the sort of do no harm component that we all learn, there's a tension there, right? There's always the risk that if we change something and how we do something or learn something or technology, that it will be harmful. But Justin often says this to me in meetings, and I hear him say it all the time, that there's a risk of not acting, right? Mm-hmm. There's a risk of not changing. And that's often underestimated, I think, in the way people think about change readiness. So I think healthy skepticism is good, especially, and it's very, I think, prevalent among physicians who are trained in this sort of do no harm concept and waiting for the next randomized control trial. We've all seen things come out in the literature and then not be able to be reproducible. And so I think they rightly so apply that reasoning with sort of technology and changes in medical education. And sometimes it just takes time to really know where they're headed.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's there's a hidden opportunity cost to inaction. So, if let's say early on in training, trainees could start using ambient and then their, work-life balance is better, their cognitive overload is less, maybe they'll stick it out in medicine longer or have more time to do other things in their training. And you won't know until you try it. And
who knows what they'll do, right? We just can't predict. Just approaching it with humility, I don't think there's any way we can really know what the potential opportunity is there.
Totally.
Sort of in line with that thinking, there are so many different processes involved in healthcare today. It's so complex. And I know one of the big things that you're a proponent of is eliminating unnecessary processes if it makes sense and it follows that do no harm kind of mantra. Dr. McEntee, I noticed one of your very first informatics projects was around eliminating note bloat. And so I think, this ambient project today, it's kind of maybe a full circle moment for you. I'm curious, how do you assess current processes and workflows that maybe need to be either stopped or ones that need to be continued or new ones that need to be started? What's sort of your framework for that in a clinical setting?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something I think about a lot because it's so hard to clean as we go, right? How do we keep up in the EHR? And what are the processes in place for doing that? Like, there's just so many stories of somebody needing something sometime, and then it just stays in the EHR forever. And that's actually one of the first projects, successful projects I was able to do as a chief resident. Is there was an old heart failure quality measure that was an alert. It was a pop-up, and it was a hard stop on discharge. I can't remember exactly. You probably remember, Justin, what it was exactly, but something around meds at discharge for heart failure. And not only was the clinical recommendations and guidelines outdated, but the quality measure wasn't being measured anymore, right? And so someone had put it in because we needed to meet some metric, and it was just there. And it was how many clicks, how many interruptions, So one of the things I was able to do was successfully navigate our organizational governance and get it through to get this thing removed. And it was so positive reinforcing. Yeah. Just as who are these people that can actually change something that doesn't make sense? But what I realized in that is that we didn't have systems in place for that sort of cleanup at the time. One of the ways we do that now is we have a sprint program. We have an EHR optimization program where we go clinic by clinic and focus on sort of one specialty at a time and ask part of that process, if it's a 3-month lead in and then a 2-week sort of on-site intensive execution of the planned work, is we ask our users for their pain points and we open it way up. Initially, there was some hesitation when we were rolling out this concept because people felt like we would be on the hook for fixing everything that people brought up as pain points, right? So there's a sort of anxiety of well, if you ask them, think of all the things they could complain about, and I sort of said, let's reframe that thinking a little bit. Ask for the information, listen to people, engage them in the process of prioritizing what's important to them, and trust that they know what matters to their own workflows. How could someone in application support in IT know what the clinical guidelines are? That can't be their job. So we have to sort of trust our specialists and then have the pathways to communicate that information and the culture in which the sort of bidirectional trust is there. To get back to your question about notebook, so that project was really sort of our best idea at the time. How do we reduce documentation burden, right? So we think of the goal way up here, the documentation burden piece. And it was, the template made it easier and faster to write the note. And then when you went back to read the note and your next visit, there was less scrolling, but that was really incremental. It was sort of the 10% improvement model. When a new technology comes out that has the potential to be really transformative, 10 times or 100 times better, or totally different way of interacting with the EHR, I think it takes humility to go back and say, well, we're not going to do it the other thing anymore. That's now irrelevant. People do that though. They keep doing it the old 10% at a time because letting go of old ideas is hard. It's hard for humans. It means admitting we were wrong or that our thinking is outdated. It causes sort of this cognitive dissonance. And you see it in people where they're just I just want to keep doing what I know is going to work instead of sort of taking the risk and having that really big transformative thinking. So I think that's why people get stuck and can't adapt and aren't willing to sort of think big about kind of pulling out old things that aren't relevant anymore. And it really gets us to the concept of failing fast, right? And failing fast really takes humility. It's a very humbling process.
Totally.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where just because it's maybe not the best solution today doesn't mean it didn't make sense for some period of time.
Right.
And that's okay.
That's fine. Right.
Yeah.
Like Justin said earlier, we have to give permission to people to realize that a solution is never going to be 100%. We really struggle with this culture of perfectionism, and it can be really paralyzing. So trying to get people to sort of break away from that, I think is really helpful.
Yeah. So this is maybe more for Justin, but organizational change is a significant challenge in healthcare. How did you leverage more of a safe, agile methodology to navigate all of the different implementations that you're doing at scale across the enterprise?
Yes, I want to clarify that a little bit. So, for instance, UVM Health Network IT for the past year and a half has changed kind of the way that we plan work to be a safe, agile methodology. So we did have several of the projects that I was a part of and helped support that had occurred before that transition happened. And then we had some that occurred through the transition, and then we have some that are occurring post-transition. So we're kind of in the state of change. The IT department, so the analysts whom I help support, it has impacted them the most because it has changed the way that you kind of approach work and the way that you look at your prioritization. I think on the whole, it's actually been really positive for us. Like most healthcare IT organizations, we have way more requests or changes or systems or whatnot than we have capacity to deliver over a given period of time. Even if everybody worked, 70 hours a week, we would never be able to meet the number of requests that are coming from the different areas that we support. So we tried to change the conversations that we had around that to make sure that we are highly reliable on delivering what we say we're going to deliver and when. And in order to do that, we had to change our methodology for really prioritizing what work we're going to bring into our given program increment. So like many IT shops, we have a program increment that is a 3-month block where we plan work within those 3 months. And that has been really helpful because it's involved establishing a new position essentially within IT called a business relationship partner. And that person is aligned primarily with one agile team, but not exclusively. And then they're aligned primarily and exclusively with an arm of our clinical enterprise, our revenue cycle enterprise, and the whole, whatever department we're talking about. So as an example, I have a business relationship partner who is primarily aligned with pharmacy. She is accountable to that pharmacy department to make sure that she's having continuous conversations about what their priorities are, and they change over time. And then she's also accountable to making sure that we have that work identified, deconvoluted when possible, so that we understand what the request is and how we would deliver it. And then also that we have it ranked. We use a WSJF ranking right now. And basically that goes up against all of the other requests from across the entire organization. And we have hundreds of them, right? Every program increment. And so then we really get down to, okay, now we're going down this list and here's where we hit our capacity. We try to fill our teams to about 80%. We don't go to 100. We really don't want to go above 100 because what happens if you do that is you lose flexibility for the inevitable things that are some things will take a little bit less work. Some things will take a little bit more work, and you hope in the balance that it all balances out, but it requires shifting throughout that 3-month period. So those have been some really important changes for us. When you go through any change, whether it's an EMR implementation, changing the way your IT teams do work, it really comes all the way back down to the people. You have to go through change management, methodology. You have to bring them into conversation. You have to create a culture that allows for people bringing up true concerns that they have and challenges that they're experiencing, and you have to listen to it. And you have to make adjustments when you can. You also want to make sure that you're making adjustments that are thoughtful and that you're not being too reactive to it's new, right? There is that period of time where things are new, where it's uncomfortable. You have to let people know that they're valued and that we're really committed to making this work.
I love that. Just the idea of a business relationship manager. Is that the title?
We call them a partner, but you call it.
And it's such a fascinating concept because it's almost like a fractal at each level of the organization and across the organization. It's a very similar structure. Same with informatics being the bridge between, clinical worlds and IT. It's really cool.
Yeah. And one of the things we're working on right now is actually directly connecting our informaticists with the business relationship partner. So that's been an iterative improvement that we've recognized. We don't want to make people to be working in parallel. Like we really want them to be a dyad.
Right. That's fascinating.
Exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. I imagine that would improve speed and eliminate barriers in between, break down silos. That's awesome. Just being mindful of both your time, we're going to flip over to what we call the Fast 5 lightning round. So this is just 5 rapid fire questions to get to know you a bit better. The first question we have is, what is your favorite book or book you've gifted the most? Maybe Rachel, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I probably gave this away a little bit earlier that I grew up in a sci-fi household. So mine's Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. Right. I just, it's such a great kind of, I call it like the gateway book into the genre.
Yes.
And it's as much about people and humans and society as it is about science. That's what I love it.
Justin?
Yeah, between work and kids and home life, I actually don't read a ton of books right now in my life, but the most recent book that I read was Carl Isaacson's biography on Elon Musk. And so, Elon Musk is in some quarters a controversial figure, but what I really enjoyed about it was some of the conversation we had here, particularly around SpaceX, where you really kind of challenge, like, we've been doing this one way for a really long time. Should we continue doing it that way, or should we change it? And so those components of that book I thought were actually really interesting to think about, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, awesome.
Question 2, who is a person either dead or alive who you'd love to meet?
Mine's Benjamin Franklin.
Okay.
And kind of for those same reasons that I was just talking about in the book, is that he just thought of these ideas that no one had ever thought of before. Like he invented the library, or started the first library in America. He didn't invent it, or it existed in Europe, but first one here. I think the post office, the whole postal system, right? Like he's like, there's got to be a better way for everybody to have access to this. So that sort of like being picture thinking, I think is great to talk about.
Yeah.
And so mine's not too dissimilar, actually. So mine's Thomas Edison. Really, really interesting person. In the reading that I've done, likely had ADHD, was largely deaf, and so had a lot of challenges in his life, but created like a tremendous impact on society, right? Like electricity, like imagine if we didn't have that. Yeah. So I would love to meet him.
Yeah. Fantastic. This next question is a little different. Would you rather have super strength, super speed, or the ability to read people's minds?
Definitely not minds. That one was very obvious to me. I went with strength. I think it would be really cool to have just like a very physical superpower.
Yeah.
Most of my out of work activities involve some sort of speed. So I love mountain biking and skiing. I try to avoid rapid deceleration. That's my main goal when I am involved in speed. So I selected speed. I agree with Rachel that I think reading minds would actually make the world, unfortunately, boring.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. Question 4, what is something in healthcare you believe that others might find insane?
So the first thing that came to mind was faxing, but I think you've had guest data before. So,
a few times.
People would just, a few times. People would just think that was insane if they knew how much we fax things. I call it the F word.
That's the first time someone said that, though.
Yeah. Like whatever you do, don't suggest the F word as a solution.
Sure.
So I was working clinically last week and I saw the team trying to steer this giant hospital bed down the hallway and just struggling like a team of 3 people to like get it in steer, get it out of steer, not, I think people not in healthcare would really think that was insane. But that's something that we like haven't done with, and nobody has disrupted that technology yet.
Yeah, and mine was going to be pagers, which I know other guests have mentioned, but I do believe within my career we will eliminate pagers from our environment, but certainly not in the next year or two. The alternative I had, so I'm going through recredentialing right now. So every, X number of years, I have to go through recredentialing like any provider does. And I think what people would find kind of insane is that a couple things actually, like one, I can't go across the lake and with a Vermont medical license and practice in one of our partner hospitals in New York without going through a whole nother licensing process, cost associated with that, reams of paperwork that I have to fill out. And oh, by the way, it's mostly on paper. And even part of our credentialing process, I just got recredentialed at a partner critical access hospital so I can provide hospitalist services there. We have a digital credentialing system, so it keeps all my information. Just add a couple things. It's pretty simple. But then I got reams of paper again from different payers that are all asking for the exact same information. But somebody has to either type it in with a typewriter or they've got to fill it out by hand. And so it's just, you look at some of those processes and you're just like, wow, this is super inefficient and ultimately costs a lot of money and reduces the ability for people to go and practice and deliver care where it's needed.
Yeah, great point. Keep a big paper in business. I guess that's the goal.
Big pager and a big credentialing.
big F word. Yeah, that's great.
Oh,
the last question that we have, and this one is a little bit new today, but what is the last TV show or movie you saw and what did you think of it?
My husband and I just watched Leave the World Behind.
Okay.
Which I think it's on Netflix. has really cool cinematography,
Ooh.
and it's just a very all around cool dystopian vibe. And it was really scary without being gory at all. I generally do not feel entertained by being like frightened or scared or like stressed, because I feel like I don't know, I just not the place in my life where I want to be stressed. But apparently I'm okay with existential fear as a form of entertainment. So I really enjoyed it.
Nice.
Yeah.
No, I'll have to check that one out. That sounds great.
For me, it was on Netflix. It's Society of the Snow, which is actually the newer version of the plane crash in Chile and the world's most impressive survival stories that I'm aware of. It does have gory and difficult things to watch, for sure. But really a testament, I think, to human spirit and will to survive and all of those types of things. So I enjoy it. I did not watch it with my children.
Right. Oh, that's fascinating. That's awesome.
Well, honestly, thank you both so much for spending some time with us. That's a wrap for this episode, unfortunately, of the Digital Patient podcast hosted by SeamlessMD. You can follow us on Twitter at SeamlessMD. And if you like the podcast and you want to learn more, please visit www.seamless.md. Again, Rachel, Justin, thank you so much for sharing the hour with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was fun.
Thank you.